Hello and welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran, here with episode 57 of season 2, 1537 to 1799. 2.5 centuries of racy history coming right up. We are now at the point where the Deccan has seen a great deal of turmoil, both in Vijayanagara and in the Bahmani kingdom to the north of the empire. In Vijayanagara, the last of the Sangama kings were everything that kings should not be. Their incompetence and self-indulgence almost lost them the empire. And the Bahmanis splintered into 5 separate sultanates, and this is the fragmented history of the Deccan that lies before us. And I will get into all that as soon as you allow me a moment to acknowledge with thanks the support that I get from the Prestige Group. Their generous corporate sponsorship is what makes this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. In the last episode, we saw the senseless carousel of kings in the Vijayanagara kingdom, each murdered by the next, until Saluva Narasimha, formerly a general, took charge and stabilized the kingdom. The Saluva dynasty was the second of the 4 dynasties that ruled Vijayanagara. Those 4 were the Sangamas, the Saluvas, the Tuluvas, and in the years after the fall of Hampi, the Aravidu. The founders were the Sangamas. The last few episodes were about them. They rose to power and controlled the entire south almost by default, because when they came to power, there were no other strong kingdoms left in the south to oppose the legacy of the Hoysalas that the Sangama had inherited. The Sangamas took the empire to a glorious position in the Deccan and ruled for about 150 years. Their dignified beginnings were sadly reduced to rubble in the hands of kings who were conceited and incompetent. This clown car of leaders would seem funny if not for the paranoid butchery that happened with every one of them, and of course, the inevitable collateral death, the loss of innocent lives that must have gone hand in hand with their doings. In 1486 or so, the last Sangama king, Praudadevaraya, who had spent all his time in his harem rather than on the throne, fled the country, and Narasimha of the Saluvas assumed the throne. But Narasimha's dynasty was exceptionally short-lived. It was pretty much limited to himself, and barely his son. That said, no telling of the history of this time of the Vijayanagara Empire can be done without a generous acknowledgement of the contribution of Saluva Narasimha, an exceptional man in the time of the worst period of royal succession. In many, if not most, historical narratives, Saluva Narasimha's life is glossed over quickly in the rush to get to Krishnadevaraya. He's a mere footnote to Vijayanagara's history, and honestly, the relative briefness of his reign might not even fill a book. But for the reason that he has been so ignored in popular narrative, I make this episode entirely about this one man. What set Narasimha apart was not merely his rank of Mahamandaleshwara, but that he was the sort that acted when others hesitated and fought when others chose to negotiate. And it was his campaigns over 2 decades that prevented Vijayanagara from collapsing completely, and if it were not for him, history itself may never have made it to Krishnadevaraya. Let's start with his bio. Narasimha, as with many of the aristocrats in the medieval and late medieval period, was a man of many talents. Apart from his indisputable military prowess, he encouraged literature. Now, he was referenced as someone who patronized the 15th century Kannada poet Kavilinga. And in the days when religion was inextricable from politics and culture, he became known as maybe one of history's first great supporters of the all-important Tirupati temple. It was during his reign as king that the deity Venkateshwara received so much royal patronage. Today, that temple is as important to the Hindus as the Vatican is to Catholics. Narasimha's origins were far from humble. He was from one of the most powerful aristocratic families of the day, and there is some evidence actually that links his lineage to old royalty. According to historian Mainaswamy, with whom I spoke a few days ago, the inscription stone found in his hometown Gorantla in Andhra explicitly links Saluva ancestry to the Chalukya and Kalachuri houses. This inscription, incidentally, was also previously cited in Durga Prasad's 1988 History of Andhra. The inscription dates back to 1474 AD. It predates Narasimha's appointment as Mahamandaleshwara, or governor or viceroy, if you like, of the Sangama king, Virupaksha II. But what the Gorantla inscription also sets in place is to recognize a tradition of the service of the Saluva family, first under Bukkaraya, who ruled between 1352 and 1377. Trying to go further back in Narasimha's lineage was difficult. Who Narasimha's grandfather was does not survive in available sources, but we do know that his father, Saluva Gunda, became Mahamandaleshwara of Chandragiri under Mallikarjuna somewhere around 1446. Narasimha was born in 1431 AD. He inherited both his family's martial reputation and, in time, the governorship of Chandragiri. He was the first to use the Saluva hawk insignia in his royal seal. Saluva in Kannada means hawk, the bird, and that reflects his clan's name and, of course, all its connotations of sharp-eyed vigilance. By 1459, Narasimha was exercising autonomous command from Chandragiri, negotiating tribute and directing military affairs. So it would seem that Saluva Narasimha emerged not from some cadred branch of the Sangamas, but from a distinct pedigree linked back to the Kalyani Chalukyas. But for all the pelf and privilege into which he was born, Narasimha was an exceptionally self-motivated individual, considering that he was committed to his duty in the face of being ruled by weak and hedonistic kings. So important was Narasimha that when we piece together the history of his military contributions, we could easily conclude what I said earlier, that without this one man's presence at the head of military, the entire Vijayanagara kingdom would not have outlasted the last of the Sangamas, and in all likelihood, it would have been carved up between the Bahmanis, a breakaway sultanate, and the Gajapatis of Odisha. And when things got untenable under the last king Praudaraya, the populace of Vijayanagara was calling for a change. Rather than let the kingdom disintegrate, Narasimha once again stepped up and this time took the throne. Because of this, many of the commonly told stories about Saluva Narasimha focus on what historians have called his usurpation of the kingdom from the Sangamas. Calling Narasimha a usurper under the circumstances is harsh. Technically speaking, it was that, a member of the military aristocracy seizing the throne from a reigning dynasty and replacing the old royal lineage with his own. The Sangamas had ruled Vijayanagara since the empire's founding in 1336. They claimed not just seniority, but, of course, divine legitimacy, blessed by Sri Virupaksha, the deity of the imperial capital itself. For over a century, the Sangama name had anchored the empire's political and ritual structure. So when Saluva Narasimha installed himself on the throne in 1486, bypassing the remaining Sangama heir, it was, by the letter of dynastic succession, a usurpation. But that word, usurpation, is not entirely fair, because by the time he took power, the Sangama state had all but collapsed. The court was riven by factionalism. The military had fractured into autonomous regional commands, and the last effective Sangama ruler, Mallikarjuna Raya, had been defeated and humiliated by both the Bahmanis and the Gajapatis. His successor Virupaksha Raya had alienated his own ministers and then was eventually assassinated by his own son Praudaraya. And what followed was not government, it was a vacuum. Saluva Narasimha didn't just exploit that vacuum. He had spent nearly 20 years holding the empire together, being its glue, defending Andhra from the Gajapatis, protecting the south from local revolts, keeping Bahmani incursions at bay in the west. He was already functioning as the real authority when Hampi had no functioning ruler. His power, when it came, wasn't seized from a king. It filled the absence of one. And unlike other dynastic changes in Indian history, this wasn't a palace coup for personal gain. He didn't slaughter rivals or declare a purge of the old order. In fact, he retained many of the existing administrative structures and continued to invoke the old gods of Vijayanagara in state rituals. His aim was not to erase the empire's legacy, but to rescue it from ruin. So, yes, by the logic of lineage and succession, what he did was a usurpation, but by the logic of history on the ground, should this not more accurately be called a rescue? And now for a small commercial break, and I will be back to discuss how Narasimha came to rule the Vijayanagara dynasty. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. RADA approved.
I would like to go over some of the context here. So let me pick up approximately where I left off. It's tempting to focus only on the moment, this seizure of power by Saluva Narasimha, but the deeper story lies in those 2 decades before. Because without those campaigns, without the retaking of Udayagiri, without the defense of Andhra, the holding of the Tamil outposts, the quiet resistance to the Bahmani pressure, it's not clear that there would have been an empire left to inherit. Saluva Narasimha's leadership was not just opportunistic, it was restorative. His rise was not a rebellion, but a response to imperial failure. His power did not come from usurpation, but from action, military, political, and administrative, when the entire state was crumbling. That's why I say that it's entirely plausible, even defensible, that without him, Vijayanagara may have been fragmented right then in the 1470s or 1480s. That the Gajapatis may have swept through the east, the Bahmanis through the west, the provinces seeking no leadership at the center would have splintered into independent chiefdoms. That pattern was already emerging. Saluva Narasimha interrupted it and put an end to everything and kept the kingdom together. So this is about where I left off before the break. Narasimha's position as Mahamandaleshwara was not a great big surprise. This would have been the domain of the highest ranks of the aristocracy, starting with family. This exact structure is visible even today, say in the United Kingdom, for instance. But Narasimha's importance as the provincial viceroy of Chandragiri took a sharp turn upwards after the Kaveri Delta tax revolt of 1429, which had its center in the Tamil-speaking areas of the Kaveri Basin. When Devaraya II had come to power in 1422, Vijayanagara was what historian Elizabeth Bridges termed already strong empire with a well-developed core state. One aspect of the strong core state was a tough and centralized system of administration, and this almost always attracts dissension. Things before and after this period point to why this tax revolt took place. In his book, Peasant State and Society, historian Burton Stein describes how, when Vijayanagara had annexed the Tamil country around 1360, it didn't abolish old hierarchies, it fortified them. A new class of imperial officials, often landholders themselves, funneled taxes while shielding themselves from the burdens that they had imposed on the people. And these officials passed on the burden of what they had to pay the overlords to tenants, artisans, and herders, and as you can well imagine, resentment built. These anti-tax protests that followed weren't just anti-state, they were anti-elite, and they targeted local power brokers who had become agents of imperial exploitation. The tax revolt took its turn, and new positions were reached with everyone. In the aftermath of this, Devaraya II, who was then the current king, moved to stabilize his realm, and he did this not by tightening control, but by conceding it. This was a display of mature kingship. He granted significant autonomy to powerful military commanders, and this was a calculated shift that reveals just how seriously empires took the threat of rural descent. This increased autonomy had one major beneficiary, and that was Saluva Narasimha. Narasimha's position as general of the imperial forces, unfortunately, was not lived under ideal circumstances. As the provincial viceroy, at the least he would expect is the support of a king. It's not clear what support he did receive, but it seems reasonable to assume that it was very little under Mallikarjuna, got worse under Virupaksha, and then went to outright anarchy under Prabhudevaraya. So Narasimha had to command an army on his own, take into account the interests of the kingdom, not only his province, map the enemy, and formulate a strategy to defend the empire, not only from other ambitious kingdoms, but importantly from the rot that had set in within. To do all this, he did not have a moment to breathe. Let's block the stage here. Let's say the year was around 1465. Everywhere around, enemies were closing in. To the north, the Bahmani Sultanate was experiencing an unexpected resurgence. In 1469, Muhammad Shah III and his vizier Mahmud Gawan recaptured Goa, a major coastal prize that had slipped earlier from their grasp, leaving the western shoreline completely exposed. Due east, the Odisha Gajapatis had moved aggressively into Andhra and Tamil country. Between 1460 and 1470, their conquest went as far south as Trichy, threatening Vijayanagara's hold on the entire eastern seaboard. They had already seized Rajamandri, and they were pressing southward through southern Kalinga and Andhra. And by the mid-1460s, they had captured Tiruvannamalai and reached as far as Jinji. Meanwhile, back home, even while the fabric of the empire was getting ripped apart by internal palace coups and assassinations, provincial governors had already begun to drift away from the center. Local chieftains had grown in autonomy, not in a good way, and the nobles had started to take local military authority into their own hands. Everything was in a mess, and everything looked broken, except for Narasimha's resolve. In those 20 years between 1460 and 1480, he swung into action. In 1466, as Virupaksha ascended the throne, Narasimha entrenched himself at Chandragiri. He supplanted the forces, he raised an army locally, and from this stronghold, he suppressed an Ambattur uprising first. In 1470, he ordered his general Ishwara Nayaka, who will feature later in this story, to launch a major offensive against the Gajapati kingdom. Nayaka captured the hill fort of Udayagiri, expelling Oriya garrisons and extending Vijayanagara's influence as far south as the Simhachalam hills. Udayagiri is mentioned often as one of Narasimha's most significant and successful military campaigns. Narasimha then turned his attention to the east coast. Now he was secure in Udayagiri, and his forces swept south along the Coromandel, seizing territory from Udayagiri to Rameshwaram, re-establishing Vijayanagara control over key ports and the all-important pilgrimage routes. These operations not only reversed earlier Gajapati gains, but, by securing the coast, ensured the empire's access to maritime trade and rapid troop movements. There are many wonderful and detailed accounts of the many campaigns of Narasimha, all available in history texts, and they're all worth the effort to read. By 1480, Saluva Narasimha had ceased to be merely a capable governor. He had become the de facto protector of the Vijayanagara realm. Over the 2 decades of his activity, he had built a network of personal loyalties across the Telugu and Tamil countries. His name carried weight. He had restored lost territory. He had held the line against both the Gajapatis and the Bahmanis. Crucially, he had done this while the Sangama emperors in Hampi were consumed by palace intrigue and civil strife, and no gain saying that they would have been the laughingstock of all the kingdoms nearby. And then in 1485, the fates intervened. The inevitable occurred. The king Virupaksharaya II was murdered by Praudaraya, who succeeded him, showed no appetite for governance, and engaged himself in visible and uncontained debauchery. Now the empire was, in practical terms, completely leaderless, Again, the kingdom teetered on the edge of complete anarchy and, of course, disintegration as a result. This would have caused the Bahmani groups to mobilize their armies, ready for a war they could easily win. There was no doubt that Vijayanagara was going to be invaded. The only question was, by whom? Narasimha appointed himself to that post. He acted immediately, drawing on the respect that he commanded among the nobility and of the commanders who had fought with him at Udayagiri and all along the Coromandel. He ordered his most trusted general, Narasanayaka, to march into Hampi. The Portuguese traveller Fernão Nunes provides a graphic account of the taking of Hampi, and I would like to quote verbatim from his text. "And so great was the captain's power that when he arrived at the gates of Bisnagar, there was not a single man defending the place. And when the king was told of his arrival, he only said it could not be. Then the captain entered the city, and the king said it could not be. Then he even entered the palace and came as far as the doors of his chamber, slaying some of the women. At last the king believed, and seeing now how great was the danger, he resolved to flee by the gates on the other side, and so he left his city and the palaces and fled. When it was known by the captain that the king had fled, he did not trouble to go after him, but took possession of the city and of the treasures which he found there. And he sent to acquaint his lord Narasimha. And after that, Narasimha was raised to be king. And as he had much power and was beloved by the people, thenceforward the kingdom of Bisnagar was called the kingdom of Narasimha." As you must have guessed, the captain was Narasanayaka and the king was Prauda and Bisnagar was Vijayanagara. Saluva Narasimha's story is the story of a general who fought to preserve a crumbling empire and succeeded. Without him, Vijayanagara would have disintegrated into a patchwork of feuding provinces. Instead, it lived on, long enough to witness its greatest flowering in the 16th century under Krishnadevaraya. Saluva Narasimha did not just win battles, he had bought time. And in imperial history, that is sometimes the greatest gift of all. Narasimha's reign after 1486 was short. He died in 1491. The empire he bequeathed to remain intact, and in the hands of his successor, Tuluva Narasanayaka, it entered its next phase. And that is our next story. In the next episode, the rise of Krishnadevaraya and his successor, Achyutadeva, and a look at the story that concerns us the most, trade. Because more than anything, it is trade that caused most of the history of the Deccan and certainly the invention of Bengaluru. All that is coming right up. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the History of Bangalore.